Hidden beneath layers of dust and time, a golden signet ring glimmers faintly in the dim light of a museum archive, its intricate carvings whispering secrets from over 1,000 years ago. This was no ordinary jewel. It belonged to a Merovingian king, a ruler from the shadowy dynasty that once held Europe in its grasp. The ring is more than an artifact. It's a key to understanding one of history's most enigmatic royal families, the Merovingians. A line of rulers so powerful, their rise reshaped continents, and their fall became the stuff of legend. But who were they really, and how did a dynasty that commanded such awe vanish almost without a trace? Picture this, the turbulent world of early medieval Europe, where kingdoms rose and fell like waves in a storm. Amid the chaos, the Merovingians emerged not just as kings but as near mythical figures. They claimed descent from ancient gods, wielded power with ruthless precision, and forged an empire that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. Their reign was marked by grandeur and brutality in equal measure, palaces dripping with gold, blood feuds that spanned generations, and whispered tales of magic and divine favor. Yet behind the glory lay a web of betrayal, ambition, and political intrigue so thick it would eventually strangle the dynasty itself. This is the story of how the Merovingians climbed to the heights of power and what sent them crashing down. It's a tale of towering figures like Clovis, the warrior king who united warring tribes under his banner, only to see his descendants tear each other apart. Of shadowy queens like Fredegund, whose cunning and cruelty became the stuff of nightmares, and of the slow, grinding forces, greed, infighting, and the relentless march of history that turned a line of conquerors into mere footnotes. But their legacy didn't just fade away. It sparked myths that endure to this day, from whispers of holy bloodlines to theories that tie them to the mysteries of the Templars and beyond. So settle in, because the rise and fall of the Merovingian dynasty isn't just history. It's a saga of power, legend, and the fragile nature of empires. And by the end, you'll never look at medieval Europe the same way again. The legend begins with a name, Merovech, a figure so shrouded in mystery that historians still debate whether he was truly a man or a myth. Some accounts claim he was born of two fathers, one a mortal king, the other a sea monster, a story that echoes the dynasty's own dual nature, straddling the line between barbarian warlord and Roman-style ruler. Whether fact or fabrication, this tale reveals how the Merovingians cultivated an aura of otherworldly power, a tactic that would help them command loyalty in a fractured, superstitious world. Their roots trace back to the Franks, a constellation of Germanic tribes who settled along the Rhine as the Roman Empire crumbled. Unlike the nomadic raiders who pillaged and moved on, the Franks came to stay, adapting Roman roads, trade networks, and even administrative tricks while holding onto their warrior traditions. The Merovingians didn't just emerge from this cultural melting pot, they mastered it. Early coins minted under their rule show a fascinating hybrid. Latin inscriptions paired with the snarling boars and wolves of Frankish symbolism. Archaeology offers tantalizing clues about their rise. Graves from the 5th century reveal a stark shift, from simple burial sites to lavish tombs filled with golden fibulae, garnet-studded swords, and Byzantine silks. These weren't just graves, they were statements, the message. These rulers had the wealth to trade with empires and the might to claim tribute. Yet the historical record remains frustratingly patchy. Roman chroniclers dismissed them as long-haired kings, fixating on their uncut locks, a sacred sign of royal blood, while glossing over their political cunning. What's undeniable is their timing. As Rome's grip weakened, the Merovingians stepped into the power vacuum with a blend of brute force and shrewd diplomacy. They played rival tribes against each other, absorbed Roman military tactics, and positioned themselves as both conquerors and guardians. When Clovis, Merovech's grandson, finally united the Franks under one crown, he didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a legend in the making. And that legend, woven from equal parts history and myth, would become the foundation of Europe's first great medieval dynasty. Clovis was no ordinary king, even by the brutal standards of his time. When he took the throne at just 15 years old, the Frankish world was a patchwork of feuding tribes, each with their own warlords, alliances, and grudges. But this young ruler had a vision, not just to lead his people, but to forge them into a single, unstoppable force. And he did it with a combination of battlefield genius, cold-blooded calculation, and a masterstroke no one saw coming, the embrace of Christianity. His first major move was pure military might. In a series of lightning campaigns, Clovis picked off rival Frankish clans one by one, often turning their own allies against them. The most famous and ruthless of these victories came against the rival King Sigebert. According to the chronicler Gregory of Tours, Clovis sent secret envoys to Sigebert's own son, whispering promises of power if he murdered his father. The son took the bait, assassinated Sigebert, and presented his corpse to Clovis as proof of loyalty. Clovis thanked him, then had him killed too, declaring the act a crime against kinship. It was a chilling message: cross him, and not even blood would save you, but brute force alone couldn't hold a kingdom together. Clovis understood that to rule, he needed legitimacy, something beyond the edge of a sword. That's where his conversion to Christianity changed everything. In the year 496, at the urgings of his wife Clotilda, a devout Christian, he was baptized in Reims. The ceremony wasn't just spiritual, it was political theater. By aligning with the church, Clovis gained the backing of Rome's fading but still influential network of bishops and monasteries. Overnight, he transformed from a pagan warlord into God's chosen ruler. A narrative that silenced critics and won over conquered peoples. The impact rippled across Europe. His baptism laid the groundwork for what historians now call the Alliance of Throne and Altar, a partnership between kings and the church that would define medieval power for centuries. And it gave Clovis the moral high ground in his wars. When he marched against the Arian Christian Visigoths in southern Gaul, he framed it as a holy crusade, rallying Frankish warriors with the promise of divine favor. The gamble paid off at the Battle of Vouillé in 507. His forces crushed the Visigoths, expanding his realm to the Pyrenees. Yet for all his strategic brilliance, Clovis's legacy was fragile. On his death in 511, he split his kingdom among 4 sons, a Frankish tradition that sowed the seeds of future civil wars. Even so, his reign marked a turning point. He didn't just build an empire, he crafted the blueprint for medieval kingship, blending Roman administration, Christian ideology, and Frankish warrior culture into something entirely new. And in doing so, he ensured the Merovingian name would echo far beyond his lifetime, not just as conquerors, but as the architects of a new Europe. The golden age of the Merovingian Dynasty unfolded like a tapestry woven with conquest, craftsmanship, and cunning statecraft, a period where their influence stretched from the foggy coasts of the North Sea to the sun-baked hills of Provence. At its height, their realm wasn't just a kingdom. It was the beating heart of a Europe in transition, where Roman roads still carried trade but Frankish warriors now set the rules. Paris, once a fading Roman outpost, blossomed under their watch into a political and spiritual capital, its island citadel on the Seine becoming the nerve center of Merovingian power. Meanwhile, Reims, where Clovis had been anointed with holy oil, transformed into a sacred stage for royal legitimacy, its cathedral echoing with the chants of bishops who crowned kings. This was an era of startling contrasts. Palaces glittered with looted Roman mosaics and Frankish goldsmiths' finest work, yet just beyond their walls, Europe's dense forest still teemed with pagan shrines. The Merovingians didn't just bridge these worlds, they weaponized them. Take their legal system, a hybrid of Roman codes and tribal customs etched into the Lex Salica. These laws didn't just govern crimes, they enshrined social hierarchies, specifying everything from the weregild blood money for a slain noble to the proper way to arbitrate feuds. And then there was their most enduring innovation, the roots of feudalism. By granting lands to loyal warriors in exchange for military service, they created a blueprint for medieval power that would outlast their dynasty by centuries. Cultural flourishing followed the clatter of swords. Monasteries like Luxeuil became hubs of learning, where monks painstakingly copied not just Christian texts but fragments of Roman philosophy. Merovingian coinage, crude yet unmistakably regal, spread their image across Europe, each silver denarius stamped with the ruler's name and that iconic long hair, a symbol so potent that cutting it could depose a king. Even their graves tell a story of synthesis: Byzantine silks draped over Frankish battle axes, crosses nestled beside amulets of wolves' teeth. Yet their greatest legacy might be what they didn't do. Unlike Rome's centralized bureaucracy, the Merovingians ruled through personal loyalty and strategic marriages, leaving local customs intact so long as tribute flowed. This light touch allowed regional identities to survive, a flexibility that kept rebellions rare but also sowed the seeds of fragmentation. By the mid-6th century, their realm was less a unified empire than a constellation of semi-independent regions, each governed by Merovingian princes jockeying for supremacy. The Golden Age glittered, but already shadows lengthened, foreshadowing a decline as dramatic as their rise. Religion wasn't just a spiritual compass for the Merovingian kings, it was a crown jewel in their political arsenal. From the moment Clovis plunged into the baptismal waters of Reims, Christianity became the invisible thread stitching together their fractured realm. The Church offered something no army could: divine legitimacy. By aligning themselves with bishops and saints, these rulers transformed from mere warlords into God's anointed, a narrative that silenced rivals and won over restless subjects. Take the strategic brilliance of monastic foundations. Monasteries like those at St. Denis and Luxeuil weren't just quiet retreats for prayer, they were power nodes in a vast network of influence. The Merovingians lavished these institutions with land and gold, knowing the monks would return the favor with something priceless: loyalty. These cloistered scribes became the dynasty's chroniclers, penning histories that painted their patrons as pious heroes while downplaying their darker deeds. And when rebellions flared, it was often a bishop, not a soldier, who brokered peace, leveraging the fear of divine wrath to keep fractious nobles in line. The saints, too, were pulled into this political ballet. Figures like Saint Martin of Tours became celestial endorsements for Merovingian rule. Pilgrimage routes to his shrine doubled as highways of control, funneling wealth and devotion straight into royal coffers. Even miracles got weaponized. Stories of healing springs or divine visions near royal palaces weren't just folklore, they were PR campaigns, proof that heaven itself favored the long-haired kings. But perhaps the clearest evidence of religion's dual role lies in the bishops themselves. Men like Gregory of Tours, whose writings shape much of what we know about the era, walked a tightrope between spiritual duty and royal service. Gregory's history of the Franks is less a neutral record than a masterclass in spin, carefully framing Merovingian victories as God's will and defeats as tests of faith. Meanwhile, bishops appointed by kings wielded secular power too, collecting taxes, judging legal disputes, and even mustering troops, a fusion of cross and crown that would define medieval Europe for centuries. This sacred political machine had its limits, though. As the dynasty aged, the church grew bolder, sometimes shielding rebels or chastising kings for excess. Yet the blueprint was set. By the time the Merovingians faded, they'd proven one thing beyond doubt. In a world where swords could win a throne, but only faith could keep it, religion wasn't just part of the game, it was the game. Behind every Merovingian king stood women who didn't just whisper in shadows, they pulled the strings of power with a grip that could strangle empires. Take Brunhilda, the Visigothic princess who married into the dynasty only to become its most formidable player. Arriving in Gaul as a teenage bride, she swiftly outmaneuvered her husband's courtiers, mastering the art of political theater. When her husband died young, she didn't fade into widowhood. She ruled as regent for her son, forging alliances with bishops and nobles while crushing rivals with calculated ruthlessness. Her reign spanned 6 decades longer than most kings, yet her name was nearly erased by historians who branded her a scheming witch. Why? Because she dared to act like a king in a world that allowed only queens. Then there was Fredegund, Brunhilda's mortal enemy and a self-made queen who clawed her way up from servant to sovereign. Her rise was a masterclass in survival. Starting as a low-born companion to King Chilperic's first wife, she seduced him, orchestrated the queen's murder, and seized the throne with a mix of charm and venom. Fredegund didn't just play the game, she rewrote its rules. When her husband was assassinated, she shielded her infant son's claim by personally overseeing military campaigns, bribing assassins, and even, according to chroniclers, poisoning her own stepchildren. Her reputation was so fearsome that enemies hesitated to strike, whispering that she dabbled in dark magic. Yet beneath the blood-stained tales lay a genius for statecraft. She stabilized the treasury, negotiated with Byzantium, and ensured her son Clovis II would inherit a united realm. These women thrived in a system that was never designed for them. Frankish law, as codified in the Lex Salica, barred daughters from inheriting land, but said nothing about wielding power through sons or corpses. Brunhilda and Fredegund exploited every loophole. They leveraged motherhood as political currency, ruling as regents for underage heirs. They turned royal monasteries into spy networks where abbesses, often their relatives, passed along secrets. Even their feuds reshaped Europe. Their 40-year vendetta, fought through proxies and poison, carved the kingdom into warring factions. The church, too, became their battleground. Brunhilda patronized saints' cults to burnish her image as a pious ruler, while Fredegund flaunted her brutality as divine justice. When bishops condemned them, they simply appointed new ones. Their greatest crime, in the eyes of chroniclers, wasn't cruelty, it was audacity. Gregory of Tours, no fan of either, still grudgingly recorded their brilliance, like the time Fredegund faced down a rebellion by parading her infant son before the troops, daring them to strike a child anointed by God. Yet their legacies diverged starkly. Brunhilda, at 80, was betrayed by nobles, tied to a wild horse and dragged to death, a grotesque punishment reserved for usurpers. Fredegund died in her bed, her lineage secured. Both left behind a lesson. In a dynasty where kings bled young, it was often the women who ensured the crown survived. And though history tried to bury them as monsters, their fingerprints are everywhere. In the laws they twisted, the wars they won, and the unspoken truth that the Merovingian throne, for all its bloodshed, was sometimes steadiest when a queen's hand held the reins. The Merovingian kings still sat on their thrones, draped in silk and crowned with gold, but by the 7th century, the real power had slipped into the hands of men who were never meant to rule. These were the mayors of the palace, a title that sounds administrative but masked a seismic shift in Frankish politics. What began as humble household managers, overseers of royal kitchens, stables, and treasuries, morphed into kingmakers, generals, and the true architects of the realm's destiny. At first, the mayors were mere servants, appointed to keep the royal estates running smoothly. The Frankish kings, preoccupied with war and intrigue, delegated the drudgery of governance to these trusted stewards. But like shadows lengthening at dusk, their influence grew quietly and inexorably. Control over the royal household meant control over its wealth, grain stores to feed armies, gold to buy loyalty, and networks of informants who whispered secrets from every corner of the kingdom. Over time, the mayors didn't just manage resources, they decided who got them, and in a world where wealth meant swords and swords meant power, that made them unstoppable. The turning point came with the reign of the so-called rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings. As Merovingian princes exhausted themselves in fratricidal wars, the mayors stepped into the void. Take the infamous Grimoald, son of Pepin of Landen, who didn't just advise his king, he kidnapped the monarch's heir and installed his own son on the throne. Though the coup failed, it revealed a chilling truth. The palace staff now held the keys to the kingdom. By the 8th century, the title Mayor of the Palace had become a misnomer. Men like Charles Martel ruled with near-royal authority, leading armies against invading Muslims at Tours and crushing rebellions with brutal efficiency. The kings they served were reduced to figureheads trotted out for ceremonies before being ushered back to their palaces, lavish prisoners in gilded cages. Chroniclers of the time barely mention these monarchs except to note their long hair, the last sacred relic of their bloodline's fading mystique. Yet the mayor's ascent wasn't just about ambition. The Merovingians' decline created a vacuum, and someone had to govern. With kings increasingly disengaged, some even described as mentally unfit, the mayors became the stabilizing force, negotiating with bishops, settling disputes, and defending the realm. In a twist of irony, the very men who undermined the dynasty were the ones keeping its shell intact, like caretakers propping up a crumbling castle. But their greatest legacy was unintended. By centralizing power under their office, the mayors laid the groundwork for a new dynasty, the Carolingians. When Pepin the Short, Martel's son, finally deposed the last Merovingian king in 751, it wasn't a revolution. It was the culmination of a century-long shadow rule, where the throne had already changed hands in everything but name. The mayors didn't just witness the fall of the Merovingians, they orchestrated it, one quiet, administrative decision at a time. The Merovingian dynasty didn't crumble overnight. It was chipped away by the very hands meant to protect it. The tradition of dividing the kingdom among heirs, once a gesture of fairness, became a death sentence. Each time a king died, his lands were carved up like a pie, with sons fighting not just to expand their slices but to devour their brothers' shares whole. These weren't minor squabbles, they were full-scale civil wars that drained the treasury, burned villages, and left the realm ripe for invaders. Take the bloody feud between Clothar II and his cousin Theuderic. When Theoderic's father died, the kingdom split again, leaving Clothar ruling the north while Theuderic held the east. But peace was never an option. Theuderic, hungry for more, launched raids into Clothar's lands only to be met with brutal reprisals. Villages caught in the middle were reduced to ashes, their crops stolen or burned. Chroniclers wrote of smoldering fields stretching for miles, where farmers once loyal to the crown now cursed the king's name. The conflict dragged on for years, weakening both sides until neither could mount a proper defense against the Saxons raiding across the Rhine. Worse still, these partitions bred a toxic cycle of vengeance. When Sigebert I was assassinated by his own brother, Chilperic, it wasn't just a political murder, it became a generational blood feud. Sigebert's widow, Brunhilda, spent decades hunting down Chilperic's descendants, while Chilperic's wife, Fredegund, retaliated by poisoning Sigebert's heirs. The royal family became a nest of vipers, each strike breeding another, until the dynasty was more focused on settling scores than governing. At one point, the kingdom fractured into 4 squabbling mini-states, their borders shifting with each betrayal. This internal rot invited external threats. With armies tied up in civil wars, border defenses crumbled. The Lombards sliced off chunks of Italy, while the Avars raided deep into Frankish territory, their cavalry leaving trails of pillaged monasteries in their wake. Even though weather seemed to conspire against them, crop failures in the late 6th century sparked famines that the fractured kingdom couldn't alleviate. Peasants, taxed into starvation by rival kings, abandoned their farms or joined bandit gangs, further unraveling the social fabric. By the time Dagobert I briefly reunited the realm in the early 7th century, the damage was irreversible. Though he's remembered as the last effective Merovingian ruler, even he couldn't mend the fractures. His sons, true to tradition, split the kingdom once more, and within a generation, the mayors of the palace were running the show. The irony, the Merovingians didn't fall to a sudden invasion or a dramatic coup. They bled out slowly, drop by drop, from wounds they inflicted on themselves. Charles Martel stood at the head of his Frankish army on a chill October morning in 732, staring down a force that had steamrolled across Iberia and into Gaul with terrifying speed. The Umayyad Caliphate's warriors, hardened by decades of conquest, had already reduced Bordeaux to ashes and now eyed the riches of Tours and its sacred monastery. For Martel, this wasn't just another battle, it was the ultimate test of his unofficial rule. Though he bore the humble title, Mayor of the Palace, he'd spent years consolidating power, rallying France's fractured nobles under his banner. And now, with the Merovingian king a mere puppet confined to his estate, it fell to Martel to turn back the tide of history. The clash near Poitiers would become legendary, though the details remain fiercely debated. Arab chroniclers described Martel's forces as an immovable wall of iron-disciplined infantry in tight formations, their shields interlocked against the Umayyad cavalry's relentless charges. Frankish accounts painted a grimmer picture: days of skirmishes in the rain-soaked fields, the air thick with arrows and the stench of unburied dead. What's clear is Martel's tactical genius. He chose ground that neutralized the enemy's greatest strength, their mounted archers, forcing them into close combat where Frankish axes and spears reigned. When the Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi fell in the fray, his army unraveled, retreating south under cover of night. Victory at Tours didn't just save Gaul from Islamic rule, it reshaped the political landscape. Martel returned not as a servant of the crown, but as the savior of Christendom. Pope Gregory III showered him with titles and relics, bypassing the Merovingian king entirely. This was the final stroke in a slow-motion coup. The mayors had long controlled the realm's machinery, but now they claimed something far more potent: the aura of divine favor. Martel distributed conquered lands to his loyal knights, creating a network of indebted warlords who owed allegiance to him, not the increasingly irrelevant kings in Paris. Ironically, the battle that preserved Francia also sealed the Merovingians' fate. Every triumph under Martel's command, his crushing of revolts in Burgundy, his campaigns against the Saxons further cemented the mayors as the true power. By the time of his death in 741, the throne had become ceremonial, its occupant so sidelined that chroniclers struggled to recall his name. The stage was set for Martel's descendants to finish what he'd started. His grandson Pepin wouldn't just wield power, he'd take the crown itself, ending the Merovingian line not with a bang, but with a quiet snip of shears through the last king's sacred hair. Tours had saved Francia, but in doing so, it handed the future to a new dynasty, one that would rise under the shadow of a hammer. The throne room was grand, the crown heavy, but the power had long since drained away. The last Merovingian kings, men like Childeric III, reigned in name only, their authority reduced to ceremonial gestures and hollow titles. Chroniclers dubbed them rois fainéants, do-nothing kings, rulers who sat enthroned in splendid isolation while the real business of empire happened beyond their gilded chambers. Their hair, once a sacred symbol of divine right, became little more than a relic, meticulously groomed for public appearances but stripped of its old magic. These shadow monarchs lived like prisoners of their own bloodline, brought to power as children by the Carolingian mayors who needed a veneer of legitimacy. They were kept deliberately weak, denied military command, excluded from councils, and shuffled between royal estates like prized livestock. When they traveled, it was under the watchful eyes of Carolingian stewards. When they spoke, their words were scripted. Even their marriages were engineered to produce no strong heirs, ensuring the dynasty would fade without a fight. The chronicler Einhard, writing decades later, would dismiss them as mere figureheads, kings content with nothing but the title. their long hair and the name of king. Yet their irrelevance wasn't just political, it was cultural. Where earlier Merovingians had been feared as warrior kings or revered as God's chosen, these last rulers became objects of pity or even mockery. Folktales sprouted like weeds, painting them as feeble-minded puppets who napped through councils or chased butterflies in palace gardens. One infamous story claimed a mayor had to prop up a sleeping king on his throne during an important treaty signing, moving the monarch's limp hand to seal the document. Whether true or not, the tale reveals how thoroughly their majesty had eroded. The final act played out with almost surgical precision. In 751, Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel and heir to the Carolingian mayoral dynasty, decided the charade had gone on long enough. With the Pope's blessing, he sent envoys to Childeric III, not with a sword but with shears. The last Merovingian was tonsured, his sacred locks shorn in a ritual humiliation that severed his claim to power. Stripped of his crown, he was bundled off to a monastery where he lived out his days as brother Childeric, a footnote in the chronicles of the men who had ruled in his name. But here's the twist: the Carolingians didn't destroy the Merovingian legacy, they absorbed it. Pepin kept the sacred oil of Clovis's baptism for his own coronation, borrowing its divine luster. His son Charlemagne would later claim Merovingian blood through strategic marriages, weaving their mystique into his own legend. Even the long hair, once a symbol of lost glory, found new life in Carolingian art, subtly reminding subjects that power, no matter who wielded it, still flowed from the old magic of kings. The do-nothing kings vanished, but their ghost lingered, a whisper that true authority required more than a crown. It needed the will to seize it. The coup began with a question, one that echoed through the halls of power from Rome to Reims: who truly deserved to wear the crown? By the mid-8th century, the answer was obvious to everyone except the ceremonial figure still occupying the Merovingian throne. Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel and heir to the Carolingian mayoral dynasty, had no royal blood. But he had something far more valuable in this new age: the Pope's blessing and an army that answered only to him. The stage was set in 751 when Pepin dispatched envoys to Pope Zachary with a loaded inquiry. Should power rest with the man who held the title of king or the one who actually governed? Zachary's response was a masterstroke of political theology. In his view, authority belonged to the one who exercised it in practice, a verdict that effectively excommunicated the Merovingians from their own throne. With this papal seal of approval, Pepin moved swiftly. Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was hauled before an assembly of Frankish nobles, his sacred hair sheared in a ritual that stripped him of divine right. There were no battles, no last stands, just the quiet snip of scissors severing a 300-year dynasty. But this wasn't mere ambition. Pepin's coup was draped in layers of ideological justification. The Merovingians had become useless kings, as chroniclers put it, their reigns marked by famine and Viking raids, while the Carolingians did the actual governing. The Church, too, had grown weary of rulers who couldn't protect Rome from Lombard invasions. When Pope Stephen II later anointed Pepin with holy oil at St. Denis in 754, he wasn't just crowning a new king, he was forging an unbreakable alliance. In exchange for military protection, the papacy granted the Carolingians something the Merovingians had never secured: a divine mandate that bypassed bloodline entirely. The long-term implications rippled across centuries. For the Church, it was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. Pepin's donation, a grant of central Italian lands to the papacy, created the nucleus of the Papal States, intertwining spiritual and temporal power for a millennium. For Europe's aristocracy, it established a dangerous precedent that kings could be made and unmade with papal approval, an idea that would fuel both crusades and reformations. And for the Franks, it marked the final shift from tribal kingship to a new model of rule, one where legitimacy flowed from service to Christendom as much as from ancestry. Yet the Carolingians couldn't fully escape the Merovingian shadow. When Pepin's son Charlemagne rebuilt Europe in his own image, he deliberately borrowed Merovingian mystique, claiming descent through strategic marriages and reviving their coronation rituals. Even the long hair returned in Carolingian art, a ghostly reminder of the old magic they displaced. In the end, the coup wasn't just the fall of one dynasty. It was the birth of medieval kingship itself, where crowns hinged on swords and blessings in equal measure. And that legacy would shape empires long after Childeric's shorn locks had turned to dust. The Merovingians may have vanished from the throne, but their legend grew wilder in the echoing halls of folklore, transforming from historical kings into shadowy figures at the heart of Europe's most enduring mysteries. Long after their political power faded, whispers persisted that these long-haired rulers carried a secret so explosive it threatened the very foundations of medieval Christendom. Some claimed they were descendants of Jesus himself, their bloodline protected by secret societies. Others wove them into the tapestry of Holy Grail legends, suggesting the cup of Christ's Last Supper had been smuggled into their care. How did a dynasty that ended with a whimper become the center of such earth-shaking myths? The clues lie in the fertile ground where history blurs into legend. Medieval chroniclers like the anonymous author of the Prieuré de Sion, documents later revealed as 20th-century hoaxes, spun elaborate tales of Merovingian survivors, hidden heirs, and a sacred bloodline protected by monastic orders. These stories gained traction because they played on real historical ambiguities. The Merovingians had claimed divine ancestry, their origin myths laced with supernatural overtones. And their sudden fall, engineered by the Carolingians, left just enough unanswered questions to fuel speculation. When the Knights Templar emerged centuries later as Europe's most powerful monastic warriors, their sudden wealth and cryptic rituals sparked theories that they discovered something buried beneath Merovingian ruins, perhaps even the Ark of the Covenant or the Grail itself. Modern pop culture injected these myths with rocket fuel. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code turned the Merovingian bloodline into a global sensation, weaving them into a conspiracy that stretched from ancient Jerusalem to the Louvre. Brown's fictional Priory of Sion, borrowed from the earlier hoax, portrayed the dynasty as the missing link between Jesus and modern Europe, guarded by artists and intellectuals across centuries. The book's explosive popularity wasn't just about suspense. It tapped into a deep human craving for hidden histories, for the idea that truth is stranger and far more thrilling than textbooks admit. Yet the Merovingians' mythic afterlife isn't just a playground for novelists. Scholars note how these legends reflect recurring anxieties about power and legitimacy. The Grail stories, for instance, often center on wounded kings and wasted lands, echoing the Rois fainéants who presided over France's fragmentation. Even Rennes-le-Château, the French village at the heart of many conspiracy theories, owes its fame to a 19th-century priest's suspiciously sudden wealth, a mystery later tied, however dubiously, to Merovingian treasure. These tales endure because they're mirrors, reflecting our own fascinations with lost golden ages and the idea that history is written by victors to hide darker truths. What's remarkable is how flexibly the Merovingian myth adapts. In some retellings, they're mystical guardians of ancient wisdom. In others, tragic heirs to a suppressed legacy. Either way, their afterlife in folklore proves one thing: dynasties don't truly die when their last king falls. They die when stories about them stop being told. And by that measure, the Merovingians, real or reimagined, are more alive today than ever. Buried beneath a Belgian supermarket parking lot in 1953, laborers struck stone with their shovels and uncovered a glittering glimpse into the Merovingian Golden Age, the tomb of Childeric I. The Tournai burial wasn't just a grave, it was a time capsule of 5th-century kingship. Gold bees adorned the king's cloak, their wings studded with garnets, a motif Napoleon would later steal for his own imperial coronation robe. A crystal ball, perhaps used for divination, rested near a severed horse's head, echoing pagan burial rites. Most startling was the ring seal bearing Childeric's name and likeness, its Latin inscription declaring him Rex King, proof that these so-called barbarian rulers saw themselves as heirs to Rome's legacy. Then, in a twist fit for a heist film, the treasure vanished from a Paris library vault in 1831, stolen by thieves who melted down most of the gold. Only a handful of pieces were recovered, leaving historians to piece together the dynasty's origins from fragments and folklore. Modern archaeology paints a richer picture than any chronicle. In 2015, a construction crew in St. Denis unearthed a Merovingian-era sarcophagus beneath a grocery store, its occupant still wearing a sword belt inlaid with ivory and gold. Nearby graves held glass goblets from Syria and ivory gaming pieces, evidence of trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. But these finds come with controversies. Take the so-called Dagobert's throne, a bronze seat long displayed in Paris as a relic of the great Merovingian king. Recent metallurgy tests revealed it was forged centuries later, likely by monks seeking to boost their abbey's prestige. Even more hotly debated is the Childeric's vase, a crystal vessel once believed to hold the tears of Queen Fredegund. Some scholars insist it's Roman, while others point to 9th century repair marks proving it was cherished long after the dynasty fell. The most tantalizing discoveries aren't in museums but in the soil itself. LiDAR scans of rural France have revealed hundreds of previously unknown Merovingian settlements, clusters of longhouses and workshops showing how ordinary Franks lived. At Herblay, archaeologists found a 6th century blacksmith's forge where swords were tempered with animal bones, a technique thought to imbue the blades with supernatural strength. In Cologne, a woman's grave yielded a silver amulet filled with herbs and a scrap of parchment bearing a Greek prayer, proof that Christianity and paganism coexisted in daily life. Yet every revelation sparks new questions. Why did some elite graves contain Roman coins placed over the eyes like Charon's obol, a pagan custom centuries after conversion? Was the famed treasure of Gordon, a cache of gold crosses and chalices, hidden during a Viking raid or buried as a ritual offering? Even the skeletons tell conflicting stories. Isotope analysis shows some Merovingian warriors grew up near the Black Sea, suggesting a far more mobile and diverse society than chroniclers described. Perhaps no find captures the dynasty's paradoxes better than the Prittlewell prints, discovered in England in 2003. Though Saxon, this 7th century tomb mirrors Merovingian royal burials with its gold crosses and lyre, evidence of cultural cross-pollination. It's a reminder that the Merovingians didn't just rule a kingdom, they shaped an era where identities blurred and power wore many faces. Every artifact, from a humble brooch to a disputed crown, whispers that history is rarely as simple as the victors wrote it. The Merovingians didn't just rule by the sword, they codified their power in ink. At the heart of their governance lay the Lex Salica, or Salic law, a legal document so revolutionary it would shape European justice for 1,000 years. Written in Latin but steeped in Frankish tradition, this 6th century legal code wasn't just a list of rules, it was a cultural manifesto, blending Germanic tribal customs with Roman legal precision. Take something as primal as blood feuds. Under older traditions, a murder might spark generations of vengeance, but the Salic law introduced Wergild, an intricate system of blood money payments calibrated to social rank. Killing a free Frank that had cost you 200 solidi, a Roman landowner only half that. Even fingers had price tags. Severing someone's thumb meant coughing up 30 solidi while a pinky fetched just 9. This wasn't barbarism, it was early conflict resolution designed to replace clan violence with calculated restitution, but the Salic law's most infamous clause, the one that would ignite dynastic wars centuries later, no portion of land shall pass to a woman, At first glance, this seems like straightforward misogyny, but historians see a deeper strategy. The Merovingians were obsessed with preventing land fragmentation, the very plague that had weakened Rome. By barring female inheritance, they funneled estates to male warriors who could defend the realm, ensuring military readiness. Yet even here, loopholes existed. Clever families used dower rights and monastic endowments to sidestep the rules, proving that Merovingian law was as flexible as it was formidable. Administratively, the Merovingians were master synthesizers. They kept Roman civitates as regional units but grafted on Germanic counts to govern them, creating a hybrid system where Latin-speaking bishops worked alongside Frankish warlords. Tax collection became an art form. They repurposed Rome's annona grain levies but added Herebanum fines for skipping military service. Their courts, held under oak trees or in royal halls, blended oral testimony with written deeds, a practice so effective that Charlemagne later copied it verbatim. Even their coinage told a story of fusion. Early pennies bore the crude portraits of long-haired kings but used Roman weight standards, a silent nod to the empire they'd replaced. What's striking is how personal governance remained. Without a sprawling bureaucracy, kings relied on trusties' oath-bound companions who enforced laws in exchange for land. These weren't faceless officials, they were often childhood friends or battle-hardened veterans, a system that prized loyalty over paperwork. When Queen Brunhilda wanted to reform toll stations in the 6th century, she didn't issue a decree. She sent her favorite bishop to negotiate with local strongmen over wine and roasted boar. Yet the Merovingians' greatest innovation might have been their adaptability. They let Roman cities keep their curie councils while installing Frankish garrisons at the gates. They adopted Christianity's moral framework but still consulted soothsayers before battle. This wasn't chaos, it was calculated pluralism, a recognition that ruling diverse peoples required embracing contradictions. And it worked. Long after their fall, their legal DNA persisted. The Salic law's emphasis on sworn testimony became the bedrock of medieval courts, while their county system evolved into feudalism's backbone. The Merovingians proved that lasting governance isn't about imposing uniformity, it's about weaving disparate threads into a tapestry strong enough to hold a kingdom together. The Merovingian economy thrived on a delicate balance of old Roman wealth and new Frankish ingenuity, a system where golden coins jingled alongside bartered grain, and trade routes stretched from the frosty Baltic to the sun-baked markets of Damascus. At its core was agriculture, the lifeblood of the realm. Unlike the vast slave-worked latifundia of Rome, Frankish estates were smaller, often leased to tenant farmers who paid their dues in wheat, barley, or honey. Vineyards along the Rhine and Seine produced wines so prized that Byzantine envoys requested casks as diplomatic gifts, while royal forests teemed with game, their timber fueling everything from shipbuilding to the charcoal pits of blacksmiths. But this wasn't just subsistence farming. Estate records from Saint-Germain-des-Prés reveal meticulous crop rotations, evidence that Merovingian stewards preserved Roman agronomy even as political order crumbled. Commerce pulsed along resurrected Roman roads, now patrolled by Frankish toll collectors. Major trade hubs like Paris and Marseille bristled with merchants haggling over Syrian glass, African olive oil, and Frisian wool. The real economic innovation, though, lay in their coinage. Early Merovingian mints struck gold tremisses coins bearing the names of kings like Theudebert I, who boldly proclaimed himself Augustus in Latin script, a direct challenge to Byzantium's monopoly on imperial titles. These weren't mere imitations, they were statements of sovereignty. By the 7th century, silver denarii replaced gold, reflecting a shift to localized trade where a farmer might pay for a plow with a dozen coins rather than a single gold piece. The Byzantines watched this economic ascent with wary fascination. Constantinople's archives preserve complaints about Frankish traders undercutting imperial silk prices, while Procopius grumbled that Theudebit's envoys arrived dripping with gold as if plundered from Roman tombs. Yet for all their rivalry, the two powers needed each other. Frankish swords and amber flowed east to arm and adorn Byzantine elites, while Mediterranean wine and papyrus came west for royal chanceries. A 6th century hoard found near Trier contained a stunning mix: Byzantine solidi nestled beside Frankish brooches and Persian silverware, proof of a connected medieval world long before globalization. Beyond formal trade, gift diplomacy oiled the wheels of power. When the Merovingian king Chilperic received an ornate mechanical clock from Byzantine envoys, it wasn't just a curiosity. It was a strategic asset, dazzling his courtiers with the donor's technological prowess. Similarly, the famed Table of Solomon, a gold-inlaid treasure sent by the Visigoths, bolstered the recipient's prestige while silently acknowledging Frankish dominance. Even conflict spurred commerce. The annual tolls extracted from Lombard and Saxon neighbors often came in iron ore or salt resources that fueled Frankish forges and preserved winter meat. What emerges is an economy as hybrid as the Merovingians themselves. They taxed like Romans but rewarded loyalty like Germanic warlords, accepting tribute in weapons or hunting dogs. Their markets buzzed with Arabic silver dirhams alongside local coinage, while royal treasuries hoarded both tax revenues and ceremonial war loot. This wasn't a Dark Age collapse but a reinvention, one where Byzantine silks lined Frankish graves, and the clink of coins in a Parisian market told the story of a kingdom finding its feet between empires. The Merovingian army moved like a force of nature, swift, adaptable, and brutally efficient. At its core were the Antrustions, the king's personal retinue of oath-sworn warriors who fought not for gold but for honor and land. These weren't just soldiers, they were extensions of royal power, bound by sacred vows that made betrayal unthinkable. Armed with spatha swords long, double-edged blades perfected from Roman designs, and round shields layered with leather and iron, they could shift from shield wall formations to lightning cavalry charges in moments. But what set them apart wasn't just gear, it was their ability to blend Roman discipline with Germanic ferocity. Where Byzantine armies relied on rigid drills and mercenary levies, the Merovingians fought as a coordinated extension of their king's will, their loyalty forged in the heat of shared victories. Siege warfare revealed their ingenuity. When laying siege to Gothic-held Arles in 607, King Theudebert didn't just starve the city into submission. He diverted an entire river to undermine its walls, a tactic borrowed from ancient Roman engineers. Yet their true brilliance lay in psychological warfare. Before battles, they'd send envoys to enemy camps with exaggerated tales of their numbers, or stage nighttime displays of torches to mimic reinforcements arriving. Chroniclers wrote of Lombard forces fleeing at the mere sight of Merovingian banners, not because the Franks outnumbered them, but because their reputation preceded them like a shadow. Comparing their forces to contemporaries is revealing. The Byzantines, with their cataphracts and Greek fire, had technological edge but relied heavily on foreign mercenaries. The Lombards, though fierce, lacked the Frankish knack for logistics. Their raids were disorganized compared to the Merovingian campaigns, which moved with precision along repaired Roman roads. A surviving quartermaster's list from Childebert II's reign details how supply depots were spaced precisely 2 days' march apart, ensuring armies could strike deep into enemy territory without outrunning their bread and arrows. Weaponry told its own story. While Byzantine swords were ornate and Lombard axes crude, Merovingian smiths produced Francisca's throwing axes with weighted heads designed to spin through the air and split shields before close combat began. Their angons, barbed spears that bent on impact to cripple shields, were so effective that Charlemagne's armies later revived them. Even their armor reflected pragmatism: chainmail for nobles, leather and layered cloth for levies, all designed for mobility in the dense forests of Gaul. But the real secret to their dominance, adaptability. When facing Saxon berserkers who fought in frenzied charges, they'd deploy archers to thin their ranks before the lines clashed. Against the cavalry-heavy Avars, they dug pits lined with spikes, a trick learned from Byzantine manuals but executed with Frankish ruthlessness. Their military wasn't static, it evolved with every opponent, absorbing the best tactics of defeated foes while retaining its core identity. This wasn't just an army, it was a living weapon, honed over generations to carve an empire from the chaos of a dying world. Beneath the clang of swords and the whispers of court intrigue, the Merovingians nurtured a cultural renaissance that still gleams in museum cases today. Their artisans transformed raw materials into breathtaking statements of power and faith. Take the famed fibulae, ornate brooches that fastened royal cloaks. These weren't mere accessories, they were wearable propaganda. A 6th century example from the tomb of Queen Arnegund dazzles with a mosaic of garnets and gold filigree, each gem carefully sourced from as far as India and arranged in intricate geometric patterns that echoed Roman motifs while asserting a distinctly Frankish flair. Even their belt buckles told stories, some engraved with mythical beasts or Christian crosses, reflecting the dynasty's dual identity as both heirs to Rome and architects of a new order. Their metalworking mastery extended to weapons fit for legend. The hilt of Childeric's sword, discovered in his tomb, bore a grip wrapped in gold wire so finely spun it felt like silk to the touch, a detail meant to remind anyone who held it that this was no common blade but an instrument of sacred kingship. Blacksmiths employed techniques lost to later eras like pattern welding, where rods of iron and steel were twisted, forged, and etched to create swirling designs resembling dragon scales. These weren't just tools of war, they were heirlooms passed down through generations as symbols of unbroken lineage. But the Merovingians' artistic vision wasn't confined to metal. In secluded scriptoria, monks labored over manuscripts that fused Celtic spirals, Roman lettering, and Germanic animal motifs into something entirely new. The Gelasian Sacramentary, a 7th century liturgical book, bursts with initials transformed into writhing serpents and birds whose beaks morph into vines, a visual metaphor for the intertwining of pagan and Christian traditions. These pages weren't just read, they were performed, their lavish illuminations acting as sacred theater for an audience of believers. Oral traditions filled the gaps where parchment fell silent. Bards recited epic poems of Clovis's victories or Brunhilda's cunning, their verses preserving history long before it was written down. Gregory of Tours lamented that few Franks could read, but this wasn't illiteracy. It was a different kind of literacy, where laws, genealogies, and even treaties were memorized and performed. A surviving charm against snake bites, whispered in Old High German but transcribed in Latin letters, captures this duality. Christ stood over a adder, struck it with his spear. A spell that blends Christian imagery with primal magic. What little written record survives reads like a palimpsest of fading voices. The Chronicle of Fredegund, a tangled web of myth and history, attributes the fall of Rome not to barbarian invasions but to a moral rot, a distinctly Merovingian spin that framed their rise as divine providence. Even administrative documents pulse with personality. A land deed from Metz casually mentions a vineyard dispute settled by a duel, while a bishop's letter scolds a noblewoman for donating stolen silver to a monastery. These fragments reveal a world where the sacred and profane coexisted effortlessly, where a king could commission a jeweled gospel cover one day and order a rival's assassination the next. The true brilliance of Merovingian art lies in its contradictions. A baptismal font might feature dolphins leaping alongside wolves, Mediterranean and Germanic symbols sharing sacred space. A queen's grave goods could include both a golden crucifix and an amulet of bare teeth, faith and folklore arm in arm. This wasn't confusion, it was confidence, a culture secure enough to absorb influences without losing its core identity. Though their dynasty fell, their aesthetic legacy endured, whispering through the ivy-carved capitals of Romanesque churches and the jeweled reliquaries of Charlemagne's chapel, proof that empires may crumble, but beauty outlives them all. The collapse of Rome left a vacuum of legitimacy across Europe, but the Merovingians saw opportunity in the rubble. Where other warlords boasted of burning Roman villas, these Frankish rulers did something far more cunning. They wrapped themselves in the tattered purple of imperial tradition while still brandishing their Germanic roots. Take their official titles. When King Theudebert I wrote to Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, he didn't grovel as a barbarian upstart. His seal bore the inscription Theudebertus Augustus, a direct claim to Rome's highest honor. Even bolder, his letters addressed the Byzantine ruler as merely brother, implying equality between Constantinople and what outsiders still called barbarian Gaul. This wasn't just ego, it was strategic theater, forcing the Eastern Empire to acknowledge their power. Architecture became another canvas for this calculated reinvention. In cities like Trier and Paris, Merovingian builders didn't destroy Roman basilicas, they repurposed them. The baptismal font in Poitiers, where Clovis may have been christened, was carved from a salvaged Roman column, its pagan past literally submerged under holy water. Their own palaces mimicked Roman villas but with distinctly Frankish flourishes. Grand audience halls where Latin diplomats were received under ceilings hung with captured Saxon shields. Even their coinage told a dual story, golden solidi stamped with the emperor's face on one side and the Merovingian king's long-haired profile on the other, a silent declaration that two traditions now shared one throne. Diplomacy revealed their most sophisticated Roman mimicry. They mastered the art of the imperial gift exchange, sending envoys to Constantinople laden with Frankish swords and amber, only to reciprocate with far grander gifts like tax exemptions for Byzantine merchants. This wasn't generosity, it was power projection dressed as courtesy. When Queen Brunhilda negotiated with Visigothic Spain, she insisted correspondence use only Latin, a language few Frankish nobles actually spoke fluently because the weight of Roman bureaucracy still commanded respect. Even their legal system absorbed Roman elements, blending Lex Salica with vestiges of Theodosian tax codes to create a hybrid that soothed both conquered Gallo-Romans and Frankish warriors. Yet their Roman revival had limits. They adopted the trappings of empire but rejected its centralization, preferring personal loyalty over faceless bureaucracy. Where Roman emperors built roads to move legions, Merovingian kings maintained them to speed their trusties warriors between feasts and raids. Their Christianity embraced saints like Martin of Tours, a Roman soldier turned monk, while ignoring papal politics until it suited them. This selective adaptation proved genius. They appeared as legitimate successors to Rome's glory while remaining thoroughly Frankish in practice, the ultimate testament to their strategy. Byzantium's reluctant respect, Procopius sneered at their barbarian opulence, yet Justinian's successors eventually addressed them as patriciae, an honorary Roman title. By the 7th century, Constantinople's envoys kissed Merovingian rings with the same reverence once reserved for emperors. The message was clear: Rome had fallen, but its ghost still walked, now clad in Frankish furs and wielding a Francisca axe. The Merovingians hadn't just conquered land, they'd conquered history itself, rewriting the rules of what it meant to be civilized in a world where the old order had crumbled. The Merovingian kings didn't just rule a kingdom, they played a high-stakes game of thrones across Europe, where alliances shifted like desert sands and today's blood brother could become tomorrow's corpse. Their most volatile relationship was with the Visigoths, whose sprawling domain in southern Gaul and Spain stood as both a rival power and a tantalizing prize. When Clovis marched south in 507, it wasn't just a border skirmish, it was a clash of civilizations. The Visigoths, Arian Christians who viewed Catholicism as heresy, had ruled Toulouse for generations, blending Roman elegance with Gothic martial might. But Clovis, fresh off his baptism and hungry to prove himself as God's champion, framed the war as a holy crusade. At Vouillé, his Frankish warriors broke the Visigothic shield wall, sending King Alaric II fleeing only to be cornered and speared through the chest by Clovis himself. The victory didn't just expand Merovingian borders to the Pyrenees, it sent a message to every rival: cross this new Catholic kingdom, and you'd answer to both Frankish steel and divine wrath. Yet even triumph came with complications. The Visigoths didn't vanish, they retreated behind the mountains, nursing grievances that would simmer for centuries. Occasional truces saw Visigothic princesses married off to Merovingian princes, but these were fragile peace offerings, often shattered by fresh raids. In 581, when King Chilperic's daughter Rigunth traveled to Toledo for her wedding to the Visigothic heir, her convoy was ambushed en route, her dowry plundered. The insult sparked years of retaliatory strikes, proving that old wounds never fully healed. Burgundy, by contrast, was a chessboard of shifting loyalties. The Burgundians, another Germanic people settled in the Rhone Valley, were cultural chameleons, Roman enough to mint coins with Latin inscriptions, yet fiercely independent. Early Merovingian kings saw them as useful buffers against the Ostrogoths in Italy, even marrying Burgundian princesses to seal alliances, but by Clovis's reign, tolerance wore thin. In 523, his sons invaded under the pretext of avenging their mother Clotilda's exiled Burgundian relatives. The campaign was a bloodbath. Burgundian King Sigismund, once Clovis's ally, was captured and thrown down a well with his entire family. Yet the Franks soon learned that conquering Burgundy was easier than holding it. Revolts flared for decades, forcing compromises. The eventual peace treaty, a masterstroke of Merovingian statecraft, allowed Burgundian nobles to keep their lands so long as they acknowledged Frankish overlordship and paid tribute in wine and weapons. The Saxons, though, were an entirely different beast. Unlike the settled Visigoths or Romanized Burgundians, these pagan warriors roamed the dense forests beyond the Rhine, raiding Frankish villages with terrifying unpredictability. Merovingian kings launched countless punitive expeditions, but the Saxons refused to stay beaten. Their tactics were merciless, ambushing supply lines, vanishing into marshland, and leaving grisly trophies, heads impaled on stakes, to mark their territory. In response, the Merovingians erected a network of fortresses along the Lippe River, manned by grizzled veterans granted land in exchange for eternal vigilance. These borderlands became a crucible of cultural exchange, where Frankish and Saxon traders bartered amber for iron, even as their kings plotted each other's destruction. The Lombards in Italy presented a paradox: sometimes allies, often enemies. When they invaded Byzantine-held Italy in 568, the Merovingians initially cheered their humiliation of Constantinople. But as Lombard power grew, so did Frankish unease. Queen Brunhilda, ever the strategist, married her daughter to the Lombard king to secure peace, only for the groom to be assassinated months later, likely by his own nobles. The resulting chaos spilled across the Alps, dragging the Franks into generations of Italian quagmires. What emerges from these conflicts isn't just a map of shifting borders, but a blueprint for medieval statecraft. The Merovingians mastered the art of controlled chaos, bleeding rivals through attrition, absorbing their strongest warriors into Frankish service, and turning defeated enemies into buffer states. When they couldn't conquer, they contained. When they couldn't contain, they married into the problem. And when all else failed, they unleashed the one language every neighbor understood: the thunderous roar of a Frankish war horn, calling their warriors to battle once more. In the shadowed crypts of Reims Cathedral, a small glass vial held the very essence of Merovingian mystique. The Saint Ampoule, said to contain holy oil brought by a dove from heaven for Clovis's baptism. This wasn't just a relic, it was the divine stamp of approval on an entire dynasty, a tangible link between the Frankish kings and the will of God. For centuries, every French monarch from Louis VIII to Charles X was anointed with this same oil during their coronation, a ritual that transformed mere mortals into sacred rulers. The ampoule's legend claimed it never ran dry no matter how many times it was used. The vial miraculously refilled itself, a symbol of the unbroken covenant between heaven and the Merovingian bloodline. But was this sacred object truly a 5th century artifact, or a later fabrication designed to legitimize the very kings who'd overthrown the Merovingians? The debate over the ampoule's origins reveals how relics became political tools. Contemporary accounts of Clovis's baptism mention holy oil but say nothing of a supernatural delivery by dove. The first written record of the ampoule's miraculous origins appears in the 9th century conveniently, around the time the Carolingians needed to bolster their own shaky legitimacy by tying themselves to Merovingian sanctity. Scientific analysis adds fuel to the fire. When revolutionaries smashed the vial in 1793, fragments were saved and later examined. The glass composition suggests a medieval rather than late antique origin, while the oil's chemical makeup aligns with common medieval anointing mixtures. Yet even skeptics admit the power of the story. Whether genuine or crafted, the ampoule's myth shaped French history for 1,000 years, proving that belief often trumps provenance. Other Merovingian relics wielded similar influence. The dagger of Saint Eligius, patron of goldsmiths, was said to have healed plague victims when touched to their sores. Pilgrims flocked to St. Denis to see the crown of Dagobert I, rumored to cure blindness until it vanished during the Revolution, likely melted down for its gold. These objects weren't passively revered, they were active participants in power struggles. When Queen Fredegund founded her monastery in Poitiers, she secured a fragment of the true cross from Byzantium, instantly elevating her abbey's status. Rival bishops schemed to steal each other's relics, knowing possession of a saint's bone or cloak could tip the scales of regional influence. The darker side of relic veneration emerged in the Merovingians' later years as desperate rulers leaned harder on divine validation. King Guntram, facing rebellion in the 6th century, paraded through Burgundy with the tunic of St. Maurice, swearing oaths upon it to prove his righteousness. Critics like Gregory of Tours noted dryly that these displays didn't always prevent betrayals sometimes, they just gave sacrilege more dramatic flair. By the 8th century, with the dynasty's power waning, even the most sacred objects lost their magic. The last Merovingian kings still touched relics during ceremonies, but the crowds no longer gasped in awe. The faith had shifted from the objects themselves to what they represented, a fading memory of glory kept alive by rituals few still believed in. Modern archaeology adds nuance to these tales. Excavations at Saint-Germain-des-Prés uncovered lead reliquaries stamped with Merovingian royal seals, their contents long reduced to dust. Spectral imaging revealed traces of myrrh and frankincense, expensive imports that signaled these were no ordinary bones but treasures worthy of kings. Yet for every verified artifact, mysteries linger. The so-called Treasure of Gordon, a hoard of golden crosses and gemmed chalices found in 1845, may have been hidden during Viking raids or buried as a last, desperate offering from a Merovingian noble watching his world crumble. What endures is the paradox at the heart of Merovingian relics. Their power depended not on authenticity but on collective belief. The Saint Ampoule may have been medieval stagecraft, but the kings who knelt to receive its oil ruled no less fiercely for that fiction. In the end, these sacred objects were never just about the past. They were bridges to a future where power, whether held by Merovingians or their successors, needed the glow of the divine to seem eternal. And perhaps that's why, even today, shards of the shattered ampoule remain on display in Reims, not as proof of miracles, but as reminders of the stories we tell to make kings and ourselves feel chosen. The legend of the Merovingian bloodline doesn't end with a monastery door closing behind the last king. It twists into shadowy alleyways of conspiracy, where whispers of survival, holy curses, and secret societies turn history into a thriller. At the heart of it all lies a tantalizing claim that the dynasty never truly fell but went underground, guarded by shadowy protectors like the mythical Priory of Sion. This idea didn't sprout from medieval parchments, but from a 20th century hoax so elaborate it still dupes seekers of hidden truths. The so-called dossier secrets, planted in Paris's National Library in the 1960s, wove a fantastical tale of Merovingian descendants surviving into modern times, their divine right protected by a clandestine network of knights and artists. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code catapulted this fiction into mainstream lore, but the real story is far stranger than any novel. Digging into these myths reveals layers of historical distortion. The Priory of Sion, despite its ancient-sounding name, was actually founded in 1956 by a French monarchist named Pierre Plantard, a convicted fraudster with a flair for fabrication. Plantard's forged documents tied his own pedigree to Dagobert II, the 7th-century Merovingian king, whose murder in the Ardennes forest became a cornerstone of conspiracy theories. Never mind that Plantard's proof included blatant anachronisms or that the Priory's claimed grandmasters included Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton, figures who'd never heard of the Merovingians, let alone guarded their bloodline. Yet the allure persists, fed by genuine mysteries like Rennes le Chateau, where a 19th-century priest's sudden wealth sparked rumors of discovered Merovingian treasure. More audacious still are claims that the Merovingians descended from Jesus himself, an idea popularized by the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail. This theory hinges on a tortured interpretation of medieval texts, suggesting the Sangreal Holy Grail wasn't a cup but Sangreal royal blood. Proponents point to the dynasty's origin myths like Merovech's dual paternity as coded references to a sacred lineage. Never mind that early Merovingian kings flaunted their Christianity to legitimize rule, not some hidden messianic connection. The Vatican, they argue, suppressed this truth to maintain its authority, a claim that crumbles under scrutiny. Contemporary chroniclers like Gregory of Tours, no fans of the Merovingians, would have leapt at evidence of heresy. Instead, they mocked the kings for gluttony and infighting, not Christ-like divinity. Yet why do these myths cling so stubbornly to the Merovingians in particular? Part of the answer lies in their deliberate mystique. Unlike later dynasties, they cultivated an aura of supernatural legitimacy, their long hair symbolizing Samson-like strength, their graves stuffed with amulets hinting at arcane knowledge. When they fell, their abrupt erasure from power left gaps ripe for speculation. The Carolingians, keen to legitimize their own usurpation, amplified tales of the rois fainéants, weak rulers unfit to govern, but in doing so, they created a vacuum where legends festered. Modern genetics has debunked some wilder claims. DNA studies of supposed Merovingian descendants show no unique markers, just the typical mix of Western European ancestry. Yet the bloodline's cultural DNA endures in unexpected places, from the fleur-de-lis, likely borrowed from their bee emblems, to the coronation rituals of French kings who mimicked Clovis's baptism. The truth isn't in cursed bloodlines or secret societies, but in something far more human, our hunger for stories that make sense of power's rise and fall. The Merovingians didn't need divine ancestry to shape history. Their real legacy, woven from conquest, faith, and ruthless ambition, is dramatic enough without the conspiracy theories. But try telling that to the treasure hunters still scouring French countryside for proof of a kingdom that refuses to die in the imagination. The Merovingian shadow stretches far beyond dusty history books. It slithers through modern pop culture, repurposed as everything from Holy Grail guardians to secret society puppeteers. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code catapulted them into the mainstream with its explosive claim that these long-haired kings were descendants of Jesus, their bloodline protected by a clandestine Priory of Sion. Though Brown's novel was fiction, it tapped into a fascination with the dynasty's enigmatic aura, blending their real-life mystique with conspiracy theories about suppressed gospels and Vatican cover-ups. The book's villain, a self-proclaimed Merovingian heir, became a cultural shorthand for the idea of hidden royalty despite historians rolling their eyes at the historical inaccuracies. Yet Brown wasn't entirely inventing from thin air. He borrowed from earlier myths like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, a pseudo-historical work that twisted medieval references into a narrative of sacred bloodlines, proving the Merovingians' legend is as malleable as it is enduring. Video games have weaponized their mystique even more boldly. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, players uncover a Merovingian tomb filled with cryptic artifacts, framing the dynasty as pawns in an ancient battle between Templars and Assassins. The game's lore leans hard into their supernatural reputation, kings with precursor blood tied to an advanced lost civilization. It's a far cry from the historical Merovingians' pragmatic politics, but it captures their cultural afterlife perfectly, no longer rulers of lands but of imaginations. Even the Netflix series The Last Kingdom nods to their legacy, portraying Frankish envoys as shadowy figures pulling strings in Dark Age Europe, their influence lingering like perfume in a sealed tomb. Why does this long-dead dynasty haunt our modern stories? Part of the appeal lies in their contradictions. They were Christian kings who buried amulets with their dead, conquerors who ruled through ritual as much as violence, a blend of the sacred and the occult that writers can't resist. Their abrupt fall, engineered by palace mayors turned usurpers, offers the perfect blueprint for conspiracy theories, a royal line too dangerous to extinguish, so it had to be hidden. The 1982 film The Sword of the Barbarians took this idea literally, casting a Merovingian heir as a sword-wielding avenger reclaiming his stolen birthright. It's pure fantasy, but it resonates because it mirrors the dynasty's own origin myth stories of sea monsters and divine destiny that they themselves cultivated. Literature loves them for their ambiguity. In Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, Merovingian myths become a cautionary tale about the dangers of overinterpreting history, while Catherine Neville's The Eight weaves them into a chess-themed treasure hunt spanning centuries. Even comic books like The Adventures of Luther Arkwright feature Merovingian bloodlines as keys to alternate histories. What unites these portrayals isn't historical fidelity, but the dynasty's utility as a narrative Rorschach test, their scant records leaving room for endless reinvention. The Merovingians endure in pop culture because they represent the ultimate what if. What if a drop of their blood still flows in modern veins? What if their relics hold world-altering power? These questions thrive in the gaps between fact and legend, where history's silences become fertile ground for storytellers. From heavy metal lyrics to mobile games, their name conjures an aura of ancient, half-remembered grandeur, proof that some dynasties never truly die. They just get rebooted for a new audience. The Merovingians didn't collapse in a single cataclysmic event, they unraveled thread by thread, victims of their own systemic failures. One of their most fatal miscalculations was outsourcing power to the mayors of the palace. What began as a practical delegation letting trusted stewards manage royal estates morphed into a slow surrender of authority. These administrators, initially loyal, grew indispensable. They controlled the treasury, commanded the armies, and brokered alliances while kings remained cloistered in ceremony. It's a pattern eerily familiar to students of history. The Roman emperors who relied too heavily on praetorian prefects, only to find themselves at their mercy. The lesson is stark: power unchecked is power usurped. By the time the Merovingians realized their mistake, the mayors weren't just advisors, they were the true rulers, and the throne had become a stage prop. Succession disputes were another self-inflicted wound. The Frankish tradition of dividing kingdoms among sons, meant to prevent jealousy, instead guaranteed civil war. Each generation splintered the realm further, brothers turning lands into battlegrounds while external enemies circled like wolves. The feud between Brunhilda and Fredegund wasn't just personal, it bled the kingdom dry, diverting resources from defense to vengeance. Compare this to the Ottomans' ruthless but effective practice of fratricide, a single heir emerging triumphant, preserving unity at ghastly cost. The Merovingians' refusal to adapt their inheritance system, clinging to tradition even as it tore them apart, mirrors the Habsburgs' later obsession with dynastic purity, another case where ritual triumphed over reason. Their greatest failure, though, was rigidity. The Merovingians mastered the art of conquest but faltered at evolution. When Viking longships appeared on the horizon, they responded with tactics suited to land-bound foes, their once innovative military now obsolete. The Carolingians, by contrast, adapted building fortified bridges and coastal watchtowers. Even in governance, the Merovingians clung to personal loyalty networks while Europe shifted toward institutionalized rule. Like the Byzantine emperors who ignored gunpowder until cannons breached Constantinople's walls, they mistook past glory for perpetual invincibility. Yet their fall holds uncomfortable truths for modern leaders. The mayors of the palace find their echoes in today's corporate COOs or political advisors, figures who amass invisible power while figureheads bask in ceremonial relevance. Succession crises plague family empires and Fortune 500 companies alike, where founders refuse to plan beyond their lifetimes and the failure to adapt. That's Kodak dismissing digital photography or empires clinging to colonialism as the world moved on. The Merovingians' tragedy isn't just a medieval cautionary tale. It's a mirror held up to any system that values ritual over resilience, blood over brains, and the comfort of the past over the demands of the future. For centuries, the Merovingians were dismissed as little more than barbarian warlords, crude thugs who stumbled into power after Rome's fall, only to lose it through their own incompetence. Early historians like Edward Gibbon painted them as degenerate drunkards, their long hair dripping with wine rather than wisdom, while French nationalists of the 19th century glorified the Carolingians as the true founders of Europe, framing the Merovingians as a chaotic interlude best forgotten. But the last 50 years have shattered these caricatures, revealing a dynasty far more sophisticated than anyone imagined. The turning point came with archaeologists knee-deep in 6th century graves, brushing dirt off Byzantine silks and Irish brooches, proof of trade networks stretching from Dublin to Damascus. Suddenly, those barbarian kings looked less like brutes and more like masterful players in a globalized medieval world. Modern scholars now see the Merovingians as political shape-shifters who brilliantly adapted Roman systems to Frankish realities. Take their tax records, once assumed to be non-existent until researchers deciphered cryptic notations on lead tablets, detailed accounts of wine harvests and iron shipments that would make any Roman quaestor nod in approval. Even their famed division of kingdoms looks different under new scrutiny. Where older textbooks portrayed this as reckless fratricide, revisionists like Professor Ian would argue it was a calculated system of delegated governance, with brother kings coordinating defense across a realm too vast for one ruler. The discovery of synchronized coinage minted in different regions, all bearing identical motifs, suggests more cooperation than chroniclers admitted. The most dramatic reassessment concerns religion. 19th century historians steeped in nationalist myths framed Clovis's baptism as France's divine birth certificate. But recent work by scholars like Bonnie Efrose reveals a messier, more fascinating truth: the Merovingians weren't zealous converters but pragmatic syncretists. Excavated amulets featuring crosses alongside wolves' teeth show Christianity coexisting with older beliefs, while law codes protecting sacred groves prove they tolerated paganism when it suited them. Even their famed alliance with bishops gets nuanced treatment now. Instead of obedient sons of the church, We see kings like Chilperic tinkering with theology, rewriting hymns, and executing clergy who crossed them, a far cry from Gibbon's caricatures of pious puppets. Gender studies have appended old narratives too. The queens once vilified as monstrous women in medieval chronicles now get reappraised as administrative geniuses. Fredegund's tax reforms, preserved on parchment fragments, reveal a keen economic mind, while Brunhilda's infrastructure projects bridges, roads, and aqueducts speak to state-building vision. Archaeologist Isabelle Cartron's work on royal nunneries shows how Merovingian women wielded power through sacred networks, their convents functioning as de facto treasuries and intelligence hubs. The old tale of good Carolingians replacing decadent Merovingians seems increasingly absurd when you compare the sheer scale of 7th century construction under forgotten kings like Dagobert to the relatively sparse output of early Carolingian rulers. Perhaps the most poignant correction concerns their supposed decline. The label Roy's fainéants do-nothing kings, coined by Carolingian propagandists, has been dismantled by charter analysis. Documents from the 8th century show these later Merovingians actively confirming land grants and settling disputes, proof they governed even as mayors grabbed military power. The real story isn't lazy kings but a deliberate sidelining, their authority methodically stripped away like gold leaf scraped from a throne. What emerges from this scholarship is a dynasty neither barbaric nor saintly, but ruthlessly pragmatic. One that built Europe's first post-Roman state not by rejecting the past but by remixing it. They took Roman roads and Frankish customs, Christian saints and pagan talismans, weaving them into something entirely new. Historians now compare them not to Attila's Huns, but to Byzantium's shrewd emperors or even the Abbasid caliphs, rulers who understood that real power lies not in purity but in adaptability. The Merovingians weren't the problem, they were the solution, one we're only now beginning to appreciate. From the murky waters of legend where a sea monster's blood mingled with royal lineage, to the cold monastery walls where the last Merovingian king's sacred hair fell in silence, this was a dynasty that defied simple categorization. They rose as masters of reinvention, stitching together the frayed edges of Rome's collapse with Frankish ambition, Christian fervor, and political cunning. For 3 centuries, they ruled not just through brute force but through spectacle, golden bees glittering on cloaks, holy oil anointing brows, and laws etched with the precision of Roman scribes. Yet their downfall wasn't marked by invasion or cataclysm. It came with the quiet snip of scissors as the Carolingians sheared away their power strand by symbolic strand. What's haunting is how much of their legacy was shaped by contradictions. They were Christian kings who buried amulets with their dead, conquerors who fractured their own realm through inheritance, and patrons of learning who left barely a word in their own voices. Their queens wielded power with a ruthlessness that terrified chroniclers, while their warriors forged Europe's first feudal bonds. Even in failure, they left fingerprints everywhere, in the fleur-de-lis borrowed from their emblems, in the papal coronations that echoed Clovis's baptism, and in the whispered myths that still tie them to grails and bloodlines. So was it circumstance that undid them the unstoppable tides of Viking raids, Islamic expansion, and Carolingian ambition? Or did they plant the seeds of their own demise, clinging to traditions like divided thrones and sacred hair until both became relics in a changing world? The answer, perhaps, lies in the artifacts they left behind. A Merovingian coin doesn't just bear a king's face, it shows a man straddling 2 worlds, his Latin title stamped beside a pagan boar. Their genius was adaptation, but their fatal flaw might have been believing the adaptations could last forever. Now we turn to you. Were the Merovingians architects of their destiny or prisoners of it? Did their choices carve the path to obscurity, or was history always going to move past them? Drop your theories below, and if you've ever wondered what other hidden sagas lurk in history's shadows, don't forget to subscribe. The past is never as simple as it seems, and the next deep dive might just rewrite everything you thought you knew.